the locked vault for more than a century. Certain doors have never been opened, not because they were forgotten, but because too many powerful names depended on them staying closed. Behind the marble facades and gilded halls of the Gilded Age there existed another architecture entirely, one built of silence, favors, and sealed records. These were not secrets whispered in back rooms. They were locked away with intention, protected by wealth that could buy judges, editors, and even memory itself. The families who ruled this era understood something fundamental: history is not written by the righteous, but by the protected. Fortunes rose faster than laws could keep up, and in that gap entire scandals vanished. Financial crimes dissolved into miscalculations. Disappearances became private matters. Lives were ruined quietly, efficiently, and without consequence. The public saw mansions, philanthropy, and refinement. What it never saw were the vaults beneath them. These vaults were not always made of steel. Some were legal settlements buried under confidentiality. Others were diaries destroyed before dawn, police reports rewritten, or witnesses persuaded to forget. Each vault held a truth that, if exposed, would have shattered reputations still revered today. And for decades they worked. Silence became inheritance, secrecy became tradition. But time has a way of weakening even the strongest locks. Records resurface, letters escape destruction, patterns emerge where accidents were once assumed, and when these fragments are placed together, they reveal something deeply unsettling. The greatest scandals of the Gilded Age were not anomalies. They were systems. This is not a story about gossip or rumor. It is about power refined to the point where consequences cease to exist. About how wealth didn't just buy luxury, it bought erasure. What you are about to hear was never meant for public ears. These are the truths sealed in gilded vaults, and the reason the elite still hope they remain unopened. The Age of Untouchables, the Gilded Age, was not merely a period of wealth, it was an experiment in immunity, an era where money moved faster than morality, and power learned how to make itself invisible. The men and women at the top did not see themselves as wealthy citizens living within society. They believed they were society. The rules that governed ordinary lives were, in their view, crude instruments designed for those without influence. For the elite, consequences were optional. Fortunes were amassed at a scale the world had never seen. Railroads, steel empires, oil monopolies, banking dynasties, industries that did not just generate money but reshaped governments. With wealth came access, and with access came control. Judges attended their dinners. Politicians sought their approval. Newspapers depended on their advertisements. When power reached this level, accountability became a negotiable concept. What made the Gilded Age unique was not excess itself, but the normalization of it. Lavish estates rose like private kingdoms, staffed by servants who understood silence as part of their duty. Parties blurred into week-long spectacles of indulgence, where rules faded and restraint was considered a weakness. These were not moments of escape from responsibility. They were expressions of dominance. To indulge openly was to demonstrate that nothing could touch you. The elite developed a distinct moral framework, one that justified anything as long as appearances were preserved. Reputation mattered more than behavior. Public virtue became a performance, carefully maintained through philanthropy and social rituals. Libraries, museums, and universities bore their names not as acts of generosity, but as insurance policies. Good deeds were not meant to redeem wrongdoing, they were meant to obscure it. Money erased consequences because it controlled the systems designed to impose them. Legal trouble could be delayed indefinitely, then quietly dissolved. Investigations stalled when funding disappeared. Witnesses reconsidered when incentives appeared. Even death, when inconvenient, could be reframed as misfortune rather than inquiry. Wealth did not need to break the law openly. It simply bent the process until the law no longer applied. This immunity created a dangerous psychological shift. When no one challenges you, restraint begins to feel unnecessary. Boundaries dissolve slowly at first, then completely. What began as entitlement evolved into certainty. The belief that actions carried no weight as long as one remained protected. This mindset did not belong to a single individual. It became cultural, passed between families, reinforced at dinner tables and private clubs. Excess was not a byproduct of wealth, it was a signal. The larger the indulgence, the clearer the message: power without limits. Behind closed doors, behaviors emerged that could never survive public scrutiny. Yet those doors stayed closed, not by chance, but by design. Silence was enforced through loyalty, fear, and reward. Servants were dismissed before they could speak. Associates were absorbed into the system. Outsiders were kept far away. To the public, the Gilded Age was a spectacle of progress and prosperity. To those inside it, the era represented something far more intoxicating, a world where status insulated every action, where wealth did not merely purchase comfort but exemption. And once that exemption was fully realized, the idea of accountability became not just irrelevant but unthinkable. The first crack in the gold beneath the glittering chandeliers and marble staircases of the Gilded Age, the first fissures in the golden facade, began quietly. These were not public scandals with headlines or court trials. They were subtle, almost invisible tremors, missteps by the untouchable, whispers of impropriety, choices made in shadow that would have been impossible under ordinary scrutiny. To the outside world, the elite continued their grand processions of wealth, but inside, cracks were forming in the carefully constructed veneer. One of the earliest patterns was financial manipulation that skirted legality without ever crossing the threshold. Deals were made with invisible clauses, partnerships dissolved in secrecy, and fortunes shifted through legal loopholes designed by the very men who would profit from them. The magnitude of these actions was staggering, but they rarely produced immediate consequences. What made them remarkable and disturbing was not just the audacity, but the smoothness with which they were executed. It was as if the laws of both commerce and morality were rewritten in real time, invisible to those without the means to see. Personal conduct, too, began to reveal subtle moral compromises. Young heirs raised in privilege without restraint engaged in behaviors that would have ruined ordinary lives. Extravagant gambling debts disappeared almost magically, settled behind closed doors with gold coins or private bonds. Affairs mismanagement and reckless indulgence were quietly contained by families more concerned with appearances than truth. Servants, accountants, and associates were bound to silence through loyalty, fear, or financial incentive. The message was clear: the rules applied to everyone else, but not to them. Even philanthropy, which might have appeared noble, occasionally served as a cover for impropriety. Donations could be misdirected, tax advantages exploited, and social influence expanded under the guise of generosity. Foundations, libraries, and art collections often carried dual purposes: public goodwill and private gain. Beneath every facade of virtue lay layers of calculation, designed to ensure that any wrongdoing remained invisible to the outside observer. It was the elegance of concealment that made these first cracks so insidious. These early scandals were rarely dramatic, rarely explosive. They were instead slow erosion, the subtle bending of truth, the silent shifting of wealth, the quiet correction of mistakes before they became problems. And yet, when examined retrospectively, they reveal the foundation of something more troubling: the normalization of behavior that would, under ordinary circumstances, be considered corrupt. Admiration for wealth and sophistication slowly gave way to unease. The more one studied these families, the more one noticed patterns of avoidance, manipulation, and carefully engineered discretion. By the time the cracks became noticeable, the structures of power had already adjusted to accommodate them. Laws, social expectations, and even morality itself were shaped to protect the elite. What began as small, almost imperceptible transgressions had set the stage for far greater excesses. And for anyone outside this world, the veneer of glamour and sophistication remained complete. Only a careful, inquisitive eye could detect the early signs that all was not as it seemed. It is in these first fissures that the true story of the Gilded Age begins. The public admired the mansions, the art, and the spectacle, unaware that beneath every golden surface lay patterns of secrecy, manipulation, and moral evasion. This was the age where power tested its limits, and for the first time those limits quietly bent, not broken, but altered in ways that would shape generations to come. The unease that emerges from understanding these early cracks is subtle, but unmistakable in the world of the untouchable. Even gold could not hide all truths forever. Crimes money could silence. Beneath the gilded veneer of the Gilded Age, a darker world operated with near-perfect invisibility. What the public admired as elegance and refinement often masked crimes that would have ruined ordinary lives. Here, corruption was not hidden in basements or back alleys. It was executed openly, shielded by wealth, influence, and a network designed to erase consequences before they could take root. Money was more than currency, it was a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a sentence in itself. Consider the disappearances, subtle but telling. Employees vanished quietly after witnessing indiscretions. Competitors found themselves financially undermined overnight. Newspapers that might have reported wrongdoing were subtly bought, persuaded, or ignored. Legal cases lingered in courts without resolution, then quietly evaporated. In this world, someone's absence could be explained as an accident, a misfortune, or a personal choice, even if the truth suggested otherwise. The elite understood that influence extended beyond their immediate sphere. Fear and incentive ensured loyalty at every level. Abuse was another layer carefully concealed. Servants, apprentices, and even family members were vulnerable to exploitation because the people in power controlled not only opportunity but also narrative. Threats were seldom overt, they were implied, embedded in contracts, debts, and social obligations. Silence became a currency as valuable as gold. The wealthy could inflict damage without ever raising suspicion. A skill honed over generations and protected by a rigid hierarchy of secrecy. Financial crimes, too, reached new heights of sophistication. Bribery, embezzlement, insider manipulation, all carried out under the guise of legitimate business. A railroad project delayed, a stock undervalued, a shipment misdirected. Each move left no obvious trace. Regulators could be convinced, witnesses paid or intimidated, and audits carefully engineered to overlook what mattered most. The magnitude of these manipulations would stagger anyone who lacked access to the inner workings of elite society. And yet to insiders it was routine. When money could silence witnesses, erase evidence, and reshape truth, the very concept of justice became almost meaningless. Layered atop this corruption were the scandals that seemed impossible to believe. Affairs that destroyed reputations if discovered were meticulously concealed through arranged marriages, hush agreements, or quiet relocations. Mistresses, illegitimate children, and private debts were often settled with discreet cash transfers that left no official record. Even death could be framed to suit the narrative. An accident, an illness, a discreet relocation. These were not anomalies, but carefully rehearsed procedures, a blueprint for maintaining the illusion of perfection while indulging the most dangerous impulses. It was not only the severity of these crimes that fascinated, but the elegance of their concealment. Each misdeed was orchestrated to appear incidental, mundane, or justified. No one could point to a moment when law or morality directly intervened, because the structures of law themselves had been shaped to protect those with means. Bribes were subtle, influence invisible, and power pervasive. Outsiders might glimpse a hint of wrongdoing, but they could never understand the full extent of the networks involved, or the lengths to which the wealthy would go to preserve their image. The suspense rises further when examining patterns across families and generations. One scandal could be managed, but repeated behaviors suggested systemic control. Secrets were inherited as surely as estates, and lessons about discretion were passed down alongside jewelry and property. By the time a family's excesses became noticeable, decades of practice had honed both the skill and the mindset required to evade exposure. Observers outside these circles saw only glimpses, tantalizing but incomplete, which only heightened the fascination. This layer of concealed wrongdoing draws the audience into a dangerous intimacy. One begins to empathize with the victims of privilege, shocked by the audacity and ingenuity of those with means. One begins to feel the weight of unaccountable power, understanding how deeply money could distort justice. Each revelation, subtle or dramatic, creates a tension between admiration and horror, an acknowledgement of skill and sophistication paired with revulsion at the moral cost. Ultimately, these crimes were not aberrations, they were structural, inherent in a system that allowed power to operate without accountability. Money could silence courts, journalists, and witnesses alike, creating a world where wrongdoing was invisible to those without access. And as the stories layer upon one another, financial corruption, abuse, disappearances, and carefully engineered cover-ups, a chilling clarity emerges. The Gilded Age was not merely an era of wealth, but a laboratory of human behavior, where influence and money transformed wrongdoing into an art form, and where morality itself was a commodity that could be bought, hidden, or erased entirely. The vaults that never opened beneath the sprawling estates and glittering ballrooms of the Gilded Age, there existed vaults that the public would never see. Not all were made of iron or steel. Some were hidden in legal documents, sealed court files, or private ledgers meticulously maintained to hide transactions, debts, and indiscretions. Others existed only in memory, loyal servants sworn to silence, confidants who disappeared quietly, and letters that were destroyed before dawn. These were the vaults that never opened, repositories of secrets so powerful that their very existence could shake the foundations of society. The contents of these vaults were wide-ranging. Evidence of financial fraud, embezzlement, and manipulations designed to bankrupt rivals were carefully stored or erased. Private correspondence hinted at personal scandals, from secret marriages to illegitimate children that would have ruined reputations. Documents that might have exposed abuse, coercion, or outright criminality were either shredded, withheld, or hidden behind the technicalities of law. In many cases, the threat of exposure was neutralized before it could take shape. The elite understood that the appearance of perfection was a weapon just as powerful as wealth itself. Hush payments were a critical part of this ecosystem. A servant who knew too much, a lawyer who questioned a family's motives, a business associate on the verge of speaking out. Each could be silenced discreetly without scandal ever touching public consciousness. Large sums of money, carefully distributed, created loyalty or forced forgetfulness. These payments were never recorded in ways that could later be traced. They existed only as unspoken agreements, contracts of silence enforced through wealth and intimidation. Yet, for all their meticulous planning, even the vaults of the elite were not entirely secure. Time has a tendency to erode certainty. Some documents resurfaced in old libraries or forgotten archives. Private letters were discovered tucked in forgotten drawers. Patterns began to emerge from previously isolated incidents, hinting at connections between financial misconduct, personal betrayal, and systemic corruption. Each new revelation reminded the public that the perfect world projected by the elite was an illusion, maintained only by the careful manipulation of information. The fear that these vaults inspired was not directed outward but inward. Families who had built their legacies over generations understood that even minor slips could have consequences if the wrong eyes discovered them. The knowledge that evidence might someday escape the control of its keepers instilled a persistent anxiety, a hidden tension beneath the surface of opulence. Ballrooms were grand, estates lavish, and portraits flawless, but behind these symbols of power, fear was a constant companion. This fear shaped behavior. Every letter sent, every transaction made, every choice of whom to trust was influenced by the possibility that the vaults could someday be opened. Generations of elites internalized this vigilance, passing it down alongside wealth and property. The result was a culture where discretion became instinctive, secrecy was second nature, and the preservation of reputation was paramount. Every decision was weighed against the invisible threat of exposure. For the public, the true contents of these vaults remain largely unknown. Scholars and historians can piece together fragments, but the full scope of what was contained and what was lost forever may never be revealed. That very uncertainty adds to their power. Suspense thrives in the unknown, and curiosity grows precisely because these vaults are inaccessible. The elite's ability to hide, manipulate, and erase leaves a lingering question: what else might have existed that would shock even today's world? In examining the vaults that never opened, one sees not only the ingenuity of concealment but also the vulnerability of power. No matter how wealthy, how influential, or how protected, the possibility of exposure casts a shadow over even the most formidable dynasty. The Gilded Age may have dazzled with extravagance and achievement, but beneath that brilliance lay a network of secrets, carefully guarded, meticulously concealed, and always haunted by the fear of discovery. These vaults, and the truths they contain, remain a testament to the lengths the elite would go to preserve their empire, and to the fragility hidden within their gilded walls. Families that survived the scandal even when scandals threatened to surface. Some families managed not only to survive but to thrive. These dynasties understood that wealth alone was not enough to maintain power. Reputation was the true currency. Every decision was calculated to protect legacy, every misstep carefully contained. While the public saw grandeur, the elite worked tirelessly behind the scenes, engineering perception, manipulating influence, and ensuring that nothing, no matter how damaging, ever fully tarnished their name. Reputation engineering was an art form perfected over generations. Families invested in appearances, cultivating a public image of virtue, philanthropy, and sophistication. Libraries, museums, charitable foundations, and art collections became more than symbols of taste, they were shields. Generous donations, public ceremonies, and endorsements created a narrative of responsibility and benevolence that obscured the chaos behind closed doors. The more lavish and visible the display, the less anyone questioned the private realities. Influence was wielded silently and often invisibly, creating a network of allies who could prevent, delay, or completely erase damaging exposure. Control extended beyond appearances. Legal systems, social hierarchies, and financial institutions were all carefully navigated. Lawyers, advisors, and family confidants acted as gatekeepers, ensuring that potential threats were neutralized before reaching public view. In some cases, family members themselves became skilled operatives, negotiating settlements, redirecting attention, or quietly removing obstacles. These measures were not one-off solutions. They were embedded strategies, passed down alongside estates and titles, forming a blueprint for survival. Even in the face of extreme scandals, embezzlement, illicit affairs, or public betrayals, these families found ways to absorb the impact. A mismanaged business could be quietly restructured, a social scandal reframed, and a personal indiscretion contained through carefully arranged marriages or discreet financial compensation. The world rarely glimpsed the efforts required to maintain these facades, but for the families involved, the cost of failure was incalculable. The stakes ensured vigilance at every level of operation. What becomes clear is that power never truly vanished. Even when the appearance of weakness or scandal suggested vulnerability, influence continued to operate beneath the surface. Elite families remained connected through marriage alliances, financial partnerships, and political ties, creating networks that reinforced their position. Outsiders might see momentary turmoil, but the underlying structures of control and authority persisted. Wealth insulated them, but it was strategy, discretion, and influence that truly preserved their dominance. The psychological impact on those within these dynasties was profound. Children learned early the importance of appearances, the necessity of loyalty, and the consequences of exposure. Stories of past scandals became lessons, cautionary tales demonstrating what could happen if discretion faltered. Over time, this cultivated a culture of vigilance, secrecy, and calculated action. The families became not only wealthy but disciplined, their survival tied as much to social intelligence as to financial acumen. For the viewer, understanding these mechanisms is both fascinating and unsettling. It demonstrates that scandals alone are not enough to dismantle power. The systems supporting influence are often more resilient than the events themselves. Even as newspapers reported crises, even as society assumed reputations were irreparably damaged, these dynasties endured. The illusion of vulnerability masks a deeper truth: true elite power rarely disappears. It adapts, absorbs shocks, and persists through strategy and foresight. In examining the families that survived scandal, we see that the Gilded Age elite were not simply lucky. They were masterful architects of continuity. Their ability to protect themselves, to engineer perception, and to control influence ensured that wealth remained both a weapon and a shield. What might have seemed like endings were merely pauses, transitions in a carefully orchestrated narrative of survival. And for the audience, it becomes undeniable the power of these dynasties never truly faded. It simply operated in the shadows, shaping history while remaining largely invisible to the world that admired it. Why these scandals still matter today? Though the Gilded Age belongs to history, its scandals continue to ripple through the corridors of power today. The secrets, cover-ups, and manipulations of that era did not vanish with time. They established patterns that generations of elites inherited and refined. Understanding these scandals is not merely an exercise in nostalgia. It is a study of how wealth, influence, and secrecy shape societies across centuries. The behaviors that once seemed isolated or exceptional now appear as systemic forces that continue to govern the actions of the powerful. Generational power is the cornerstone of this continuity. Families that survived scandal understood that their greatest asset was not a single fortune or title, but the ability to maintain influence over decades. Knowledge of past indiscretions, strategies for concealment, and networks of loyal allies were passed down alongside estates and investments. Children were educated not only in finance and etiquette but in the subtle art of discretion. They learned how to navigate public perception, how to silence threats without leaving traces, and how to cultivate authority that seemed effortless. In effect, each generation inherited both wealth and the invisible mechanisms required to preserve it. The principle of inherited silence remains particularly potent. The unspoken rules of secrecy established in the Gilded Age created a culture in which wrongdoing could exist without accountability. Missteps were corrected quietly, mistakes erased, and reputations maintained through calculated intervention. This ethos has endured. Today, we still see patterns of influence where the wealthy can avoid scrutiny through networks of advisors, legal experts, and media allies. The same logic applies. If the public sees only the facade, the mechanisms behind it remain untouchable. Secrets become tradition and silence a form of power passed like any other inheritance. Moreover, the Gilded Age scandals illuminate the broader social and psychological consequences of concentrated wealth. The capacity to manipulate truth and evade consequence fosters a sense of moral immunity, which can persist for generations. When wrongdoing produces no meaningful accountability, the behavior becomes normalized. It teaches each successive generation that influence can insulate them from both law and societal judgment. The lessons embedded in these scandals are therefore not confined to history books. They are embedded in ongoing patterns of elite behavior, shaping policy, economics, and social hierarchies even today. Examining these scandals also provides insight into the mechanisms of systemic control. The tools employed by the Gilded Age elite, strategic philanthropy, public image engineering, selective transparency, and quiet enforcement of loyalty, are still in use, albeit in modern forms. Corporations, political dynasties, and global elites continue to rely on carefully curated appearances, legal protections, and media influence to maintain authority. The historical record demonstrates that when power is concentrated and protected, wrongdoing can persist virtually unchecked. This continuity encourages a deeper understanding of contemporary social structures, revealing why certain behaviors remain resilient despite apparent reform. Importantly, these historical scandals also serve as cautionary tales. They expose the fragility of public oversight when confronted with extreme wealth and influence, highlighting the necessity of vigilance, accountability, and transparency. Observers today can draw lessons from the past that institutions, laws, and social norms are only as effective as their enforcement, and that concentrated power always carries the potential for abuse if left unchecked. The past becomes a lens through which to assess present-day governance, financial systems, and elite behavior. For the audience, connecting these scandals to contemporary life transforms the story from a historical curiosity into a compelling insight. The shock of gilded secrets evolves into recognition of enduring patterns. Wealth, secrecy, and influence did not disappear. They adapted, perpetuated, and learned from the lessons of the past. By tracing the legacy of these scandals, viewers gain not only understanding of history but clarity on the subtle forces that continue to shape the world today. The Gilded Age, with all its brilliance and corruption, becomes more than a period of indulgence. It becomes a mirror reflecting the enduring dynamics of power, influence, and human behavior. Ultimately, these scandals matter because they reveal that power is rarely ephemeral. What appears to be a bygone era of mistakes and indulgence is in fact a blueprint for the resilience of influence. The Gilded Age teaches that wealth can protect, conceal, and perpetuate itself, and that understanding the past is essential to seeing how similar forces operate in the present. Through these revelations, the audience is left with a profound awareness. The vaults may be closed, the scandals buried, but the mechanisms behind them continue to echo, shaping generations long after the gilded halls have quieted. The final lock on the vault, as we draw the story to its conclusion. The Gilded Age does not leave us with dramatic confessions or explosive revelations. Instead, it leaves us with an unsettling truth. Power, wealth, and secrecy are far more enduring than we often imagine. The vaults that held the darkest scandals of the era remain, in many ways, still locked. Not because the evidence is gone entirely, but because the structures built to protect it, the alliances, the influence, the careful cultivation of perception, persist. The elite learned long ago that their greatest protection was not brute force, but subtlety, discretion, and the shaping of narrative itself. There is a haunting elegance in this. The very systems that allowed greed, manipulation, and abuse to flourish have survived, quietly evolving with time. Laws change, governments rise and fall, and generations pass, yet the principles of influence, discretion, and inherited authority remain remarkably resilient. For every scandal we uncover, countless others remain beyond the reach of history. And perhaps this is the most chilling lesson: the past is not truly past, because the mechanisms that allowed secrecy and power to operate are still very much alive. Reflecting on these hidden truths, one begins to understand the duality of the Gilded Age. On the surface, it dazzled with wealth, innovation, and sophistication. Beneath, it experimented with moral immunity, exploiting loopholes and bending society to the will of the few. The fascination with the era is not merely about luxury or excess, it is about human behavior under conditions of unchecked power. It is about the lengths to which individuals and families will go to preserve legacy, and the quiet compromises that ensure survival in a world where rules are optional. Even as we close the narrative, the sense of incompleteness lingers. The vaults that never opened hint at more than they reveal, and that ambiguity is deliberate. The uncertainty forces reflection. If these scandals were contained, hidden, or erased, what does that say about the systems we trust today? What patterns of influence, secrecy, and moral negotiation continue to operate unseen in our own time? The Gilded Age serves as both mirror and warning, suggesting that while we study history for clarity, it often offers only partial truths, curated by those with the means to control perception. This reflective closure also transforms our relationship with power itself. It compels the audience to question the narratives presented as fact, to recognize the subtle operations of influence, and to consider how wealth and secrecy intersect to shape society. The stories of vanished letters, destroyed ledgers, and discreetly resolved crises are not anomalies. They are templates, quietly instructing future generations on how to navigate the delicate balance between visibility and concealment. In that sense, the Gilded Age continues to teach, not with overt drama, but through its enduring patterns and unspoken rules. The final lock on the vault, then, is both literal and metaphorical. It represents the enduring protection of secrets, the invisible architecture of elite survival, and the haunting idea that history itself is curated by those who can afford to control it. The lessons are subtle but profound. The past shapes the present, influence persists through generations, and some truths remain inaccessible by design. What is left is a lingering tension, a quiet unease that encourages further exploration, reflection, and curiosity. As the audience steps away from this story, the effect is not a rush of closure but a deep, contemplative unease. One cannot help but wonder about the unseen layers of power, the stories that were never told, and the human capacity for both ingenuity and moral compromise. The Gilded Age, with all its brilliance and shadow, has closed its doors once more, but its lessons echo. The vault remains locked, the secrets remain powerful, and the audience leaves not just with knowledge, but with a sense of awe and trepidation, primed to question, explore, and perhaps binge the stories of those who continue to wield influence in ways both visible and hidden. The era may have ended, but its shadows linger, inviting us to peer behind the gilded doors and wonder how much of history has been curated and how much remains hidden, still shaping the world we inhabit today.